negotiations you're thinking of today. So common examples in organizations would be things like negotiation within your team or within your department, between your department and other divisions of the organization. My husband has a startup here in Pittsburgh, a medical device company. There's always negotiations between the engineering side, who are building the product, and then the business side, right? So when he's making commitments to investors or to whomever about deadlines and things, right? He has to negotiate with the engineering department of when are you actually going to be able to build this, what are the specifications. So that is a common one that he faces, and many of you might face too, in all organizations between different areas where people have different priorities, different constraints, right? How do you resolve these? Negotiations between vendors and clients, different service providers, investors, and of course, at some point in our careers, or often multiple points, we negotiate our compensation packages. So, thinking of all these different ways in which we may negotiate in our work lives, what comes to mind today for you when you think about negotiations? What brings you here in terms of some of the challenging ones you are facing now or have coming up? Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of what I'm doing right now is kind of like in a startup, is try to find the first client, try to find the first selling product. I mean, for someone to actually come in with no trust. And I think there's a lot of negotiation involved in, maybe not negotiation, but probably negotiation and trying to like get the first meeting and trying to make the first sale. So.
Yeah, I think you're right to look at that through the lens of negotiation because, like you said, there's issues of trust, and you're trying to cold call people, make some connections, new relationships, and they're trying to figure out, who are you? Can I trust you? Should we have a relationship? So that's certainly the early phase of negotiation is building that relationship, just trying to get people to the table to start discussing. And often we think of negotiation as that very sort of once we're at the table we go back and forth, but the whole process starts much earlier, as you point out. Yeah, go ahead.
Negotiating price after that.
Yeah, right. It's the price of what kinds of prices.
Like if you're offering some product or service, I found that it's like, especially like when you're new to it, it's like building that trust to someone and I'm not sure if you're really going to provide something good, so I'm going to mitigate my risk by dropping the price because you want your margins to be good.
Right. So and it's nice that you think about like the different issues or why where price comes in because there's the basic issue of price. It's a resource that we're trying to distribute. Right. If I'm a seller, I want to sell for more. Buyers want to buy for less. But then there's these other issues about risk and trying to figure out will they deliver what they say they're going to deliver, and then how do you adjust for that? Whether it's through contingencies and the kinds of contracts, if you get it done by this date, there's a certain bonus or certain penalties if it's beyond that. And so how do all these different issues work together? One thing as we'll go over today is when there's multiple issues on the table, that's when there's going to be often opportunities to create value as opposed to just distributing it. Thinking about all the different issues that you might consider, price is often a big one, and then thinking about what are the other things that we care about, what are the other things the other side cares about. All right, price, building trust with new relationships. Any other negotiations you're thinking of today? Yeah.
I don't have it myself, but a number of our startups negotiate the valuation of their company when they're getting investment.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you see as the key challenges that companies struggle with there in terms of
They
negotiating?
think their valuation should be higher.
Should be higher, right? Yeah, and so what makes that challenging is because it's incomplete information, and that's going to be the key challenge in all negotiations is, from one side you might think the company is worth so much, should be valued higher, and you have some information. The other side is working from maybe a different set of assumptions, different information, and to the extent that the different parties have access to different information or are weighting those issues differently, it can lead to some real disagreements that you have to work through. Good. So, well, it turns out if you're not feeling very confident in your negotiating skills, you're not alone because most people aren't very good at it. Even people who do it all the time often fall prey to common traps. Very few managers will reach these win-win outcomes, even in situations where there's clearly compatible issues or clearly areas where you can have effective trade-offs. And what I find fascinating is that there are cases where both sides will want the exact same thing, and either they don't talk about it or they make assumptions about the other side and they miss these compatible issues. So why do people make mistakes in negotiation? What are some common traps? So some of these may resonate with you or that you've witnessed or experienced. One of the most common traps is what we can think of as the lose-lose negotiation. And this is best highlighted with the stories of the sisters in the orange, which some of you may have heard if you've read any negotiation books or articles. This comes from the book Getting to Yes, and they talk about the story of the sisters in the oranges, where there's one orange and two sisters. Okay, they go back and forth. I want the orange. No, I want the orange. And so they decide, okay, what's fair? We'll cut it in half, and you get half, and the other sister gets half. Well, one sister probably peels the orange, throws away the peel, eats the fruit, while the other sister peels the orange, throws away the fruit, and uses the peel to make her favorite orange bundt cake. Neither side was able to effectively ask or address the question of, why do you want the orange? What's important to you here? What are you going to do with the orange? You don't have this wasted value, right? It's not this lose-lose situation. Okay, so that's obviously, you're not negotiating about oranges, but this common trap you'll see in all kinds of different areas, right? We see this as a framework for thinking about what happens when you don't understand the other side's interests. We know their positions, what they say they want, I want the orange, but then what's the interest? Why? Why is that so important to you? And so in negotiations, you have to figure out not only what your position is, but what's your interest, and for the other side, what's their position, what do they say they want, but why do they want it? Why is it so important? Another common trap is the winner's curse. You think of this settling for too little. You get what you ask for, rather than being happy about it. You're like, oh, why did they smile at the end? That was too easy. Well, what don't I know here? Maybe I'm not getting a good deal, right? So this can happen because you're not sufficiently prepared. You don't know. You don't have all the information that you might need. So you make a first offer, and the other side accepts immediately, and you're thinking, oh, maybe that wasn't a good offer. But you can also think it from the other side. You might think that if you agree quickly or easily, that you're being cooperative, that you're being nice, that you're helping the other side. But ironically, you might make them more unsatisfied because they're thinking that they have the winner's curse, right? Because they're expecting it to be a tough negotiation. You accept their first offer, and rather than being happy about it, they feel this winner's curse. So, right, you want to think of that from both sides. The last two traps here can either be a trap or an effective strategy, depending on what is your best alternative, right? So sometimes we're in a situation where, unfortunately, we don't have many good options. We can't just go do a deal elsewhere. We can't just go talk to another investor or go somewhere else. In those situations, it can be a real trap to walk away from the table or walk away too soon. But it can happen, right? Emotions come into play, pride, anger. We have lots of biases. We're overly optimistic, overly confident about what might happen in the future. There's an expression, don't cut off your nose to spite your face, about pride. A student once told me there was a Chinese analog of that expression, don't burn down your own house just to spite your mother-in-law. But this idea that sometimes emotions, there could be some good potential deals on the table, but we walk away when we really shouldn't. On the other hand, sometimes we agree when we shouldn't agree, when we should walk away. But maybe we do have a better alternative. We can fall into what we think of as the agreement trap. Right? We want to get to yes, we want to close the deal, because uncertainty is stressful. Right? And we get so focused on the task at hand that we may lose sight that we actually have better alternatives elsewhere. So maybe we have really good options elsewhere, but we've invested so much into this one relationship, this one deal, that we end up agreeing when we shouldn't. Right? So you have to think about, whenever you're entering into an agreement, what's my best alternative? What am I going to do if I don't reach a deal today? Okay? And then figure out, I should only reach a deal if this option is better than my best alternative. And if I walk away, then I want to make sure I have a better option. Any thoughts come to mind when you hear these traps? Any resonator examples? Okay, so when you think of how to negotiate, you're balancing these two sides. On the one hand, you're trying to claim value, what we can think of as distributive strategy, where you're claiming a slice of the pie. But on the other hand, you're also trying to grow the pie by creating value. You think of this as integrative negotiations. It's the win-win idea. So on the one hand, if it's a purely distributive kind of negotiation, you purely claiming value approach, that's very much a win-lose approach to negotiation, right? You're searching for strategies that meet your own needs, not really thinking about the other side. If that's your approach, you would conceal information, right? Use it very strategically, very position-based as opposed to interest-based. Often a single issue, so price, for example, short-term relationship. And you can contrast that with the other side of negotiation, that often you might use a strategy that's more integrated. If there's a long-term relationship, if there's multiple issues on the table, you're focused on the interests rather than positions, so why you want something rather than just what you want. And really searching for solutions that that meet both parties' needs, rather than just one side. If you're doing that, you often share information more openly about your interest and priorities. That doesn't mean everything about your side. You wouldn't share information about your bottom line or your alternatives or these other things, but sharing information about what you want and why you want it. Here are my top 3 issues. Here are areas where I'm more flexible. Here's the areas where I'm less flexible. Right? That's going to help grow the pie. Okay, so the integrative approach to negotiations was first discussed in 1981, this book, Getting to Yes, which has subsequently been updated about every 10 years. And there's a few key points that I think are important. The first point, the main theme of the book is that negotiation can be thought of as problem solving, right? So negotiation happens when each side wants something and they're trying to figure out, can we reach an agreement that's better for both of us than our alternatives? Right, so how do we do that? Well, the first thing to do is to separate the people from the problem. Now, sometimes the people are the problem, right? And that's tough. But more often than not, you're coming together, you're having these discussions, trying to work with the other side because you think there's something, some kind of agreement or solution you can come up with together that's better, respectively, than each of your alternatives. And so rather than think of this as an antagonistic, we're across the table arguing with one another, rather, how can we work together on the same side of the table to come up with some agreement that meets both of our needs? Okay, so separate the people from the problem and focus on interest, not positions, right? That's the why you want it versus what you want. Because if you're trying to solve a problem, there's often many ways to solve a problem, right? You might have the positions, I'd like to, buy for less, you'd like to sell for more, but then there's all the other things you care about, right? And what are the interests? Why is that important to you? Why is, you say there's this deadline. Why is time of the essence? Why do you need price to be high? Is it better to have the payments up front or space it out over time, right? What's the underlying interest? And then if you're focused on the interest, you can generate multiple possibilities to come trying to solve this problem. Rather than just choosing one side's position or the other, or just compromise by, say, cutting that orange in half. Now, my favorite piece of advice from this book, but I think it's the one that's often the most difficult to implement in practice, is the idea to use objective standards. And this gets, I think, kids comment about the evaluation and why it can sometimes be hard, because what are the standards? What should we measure this against? If both sides can agree that these are the reference points we should use, these are the prior deals that have been done. If it's real estate, these are the prior houses that have sold in this neighborhood, right? Or this is the prior contracts that we've signed, prior kinds of agreements. If both sides can agree on what the standards are, it makes it much easier to come to some kind of agreement. When you're in situations, and often this is the case with startups and entrepreneurship, because you're doing something totally new, or at least somewhat new, sometimes it's hard to figure out what are those standards, what are our reference points, how do we come up with those numbers, right? So really search for those and try and figure out what would the standards be, right? And the more evidence you can bring to bear on that, it's going to make the negotiation more about problem solving rather than this argument about, well, I think it should be this and you think it should be that. Okay. So if you can use this integrative style to negotiation, it's going to help you prevent impasses, right? Prevent people from walking away when they shouldn't. It's going to improve outcomes because you're able to grow the pie as well as get a bigger share of it. And then because neither side because you're growing the pie, both sides feel like they're gaining something from it, and it's going to create then more stability in the agreement and more implementation. If people really feel like they're losing, maybe they agree to something, but they don't actually implement it. They might try and undermine the deal. Right? So you want to make sure there's some enduring, so that the agreement's enduring. Okay, and ultimately, if you do that, it helps strengthen the relationship. Okay. So, this is in the orange. Here's a real-life example in the Middle East, 1978. So, negotiation between Israel and Egypt. Instead of an orange that two sisters are arguing about, now it's Israel and Egypt arguing about a piece of land. Okay, so the Sinai Peninsula. But the same setup, right? We want this land, no, we want this land. Can't just cut it in half. Intractable Middle East conflict, they're deadlocked, they bring in mediators. The mediators ask the question about interest. Why? Israel, why is this land so important to you? Why? Israel, why is this land so important to you? Well, if they have this land, there'll be tanks in our border, we'll never be safe. Safety is our key issue here. So in no way we're giving up this land. Okay, so the position, we want this land, but the interest is safety. Egypt, same question. Why is this land so important to you? We need to maintain the integrity of these century-old borders. Right? We can't give up our sovereignty. There's no way we're giving up this land. And so the ultimate peace accord that was reached was a demilitarized zone. Right? Egypt controls the land, maintains their interest of sovereignty. Right? Those borders are maintained. But it's demilitarized. No tanks on the borders. Maintaining Israel's interest in safety. So this comes from the book Getting to Yes as well. And what I like about this example is when you read it, you're like, oh, of course, that solution makes so much sense. It's so elegant. But then you think about the reality of what it must be like to get to this agreement. Right? You need trust. You need to believe that the two parties are going to follow through. So just because there's some good options and good integrative agreements out there does not mean they're going to be easy to get to. Right? It takes a lot of hard work to build those relationships, to build trust, to really make the other side understand, and for yourself to understand that this does meet their interests of both sides. Yeah, go ahead.
So when we're talking about trying to understand interest versus position, the question of why you're taking a certain position, especially I think the word why can kind of come across sometimes as like intruding, or sometimes people take it personally, like, well, you know, why are you questioning in a way of the position that I'm in? So what are ways that you can get to getting that answer and kind of getting to this, you know, I guess this, whatever their answer is, the solution of it, without asking like why?
With directing. Yeah, so it's a great question, and I have some slides in a bit that will dig deeper. But briefly, I think the point you highlight that's an excellent one is we're trying to figure out information. That's an excellent one is we're trying to figure out information about interest, and we can do that with direct questions. But sometimes it might be better to do that more indirectly or some combination. And there's lots of differences interpersonally, culturally, about how comfortable people are with directness, right? And that might depend on how much a relationship you have. And then, you know, certain parts of the world, you know, direct questions maybe not be seen as appropriate, right? And whereas in the US, it tends to be a pretty direct kind of communication culture. But that said, so you can certainly think about how you ask the question in more diplomatic ways. So maybe it's not just asking why, but sharing some information about yourself, saying, you know, my key issues here are these three things. Tell me more about some of your priorities. You know, I understand that this is really important to you. What else? What more can you tell me about what that means to you? Right. So you can think really about how you ask those questions in a way that's not going to put the person on the defensive. The other way that's more indirect, but that can be effective, is if you give people options, and then you see which options they gravitate towards, or areas where they don't have any flexibility. So for example, if you had 3 different packages, and you say, well, just to start, here's 3 different options we're considering. Just as a starting point, which of these options would you like the best? And you know, then we can work from there. And they might say something like, well, I hate all of them. And you say, well, okay, which do you hate the most? Or which do you hate the least? And you're still getting information, because you see, what are they saying? They're saying, oh, well, this is, they're never going to budge on this certain issue, so that must be something that's a priority to them. So there's, I think you certainly want to ask some things directly. You can figure out what wording would put people maybe on so they're less defensive. But then how do you gather information indirectly by seeing the big areas where they're more flexible, seeing where they're less flexible? And then you can certainly parrot that back and say, okay, it sounds to me like this is really important to you. You know, is that the case? Or tell me more about that. So doing it in a way, framing your communication in a way that you're trying to understand them, people tend to be receptive to that because they think you're interested, and you are. I'm not sure I would agree with the premise that just asking why will necessarily put people on the defensive. I think there's a lot about the nuance of how you ask that if you frame it in a way that they feel respected. It's usually less about what you say than how people interpret, do they feel respected by the way in which you're communicating with them, which is sometimes less about the question itself and more about how it's framed. Good question. We'll come back to that when we think about building trust and some of these other issues. So the goal, what I would say for effective negotiation, is to come up with enduring agreements. Right? Agreements were relatively balanced. That doesn't mean that it's 50-50 split, but agreements where both people feel like they're getting something out of the deal, so they're going to satisfy their interest. Right? They're going to be easy to implement and improve the relationship. Right? Now, sometimes it's a very short-term interaction, and if it's very lopsided, there's no real consequences to that. But more often than not, we're dealing with people over some kind of long-term, or even if we're not dealing with them directly, the reputations matter, right? And certainly in Pittsburgh, but in the entrepreneurship space, more generally, it's a very small community. I think in many ways it comes, Dave could tell you more about that, but it's a very small community. People get reputations, so these deals matter, right? And relationships matter. So this tension between creating value, claiming value, you can think of as based on these dual concerns in negotiation. On the one hand, you're advocating for yourself, right? Attempting to satisfy your own concerns. If you only focus on yourself, that's a very competitive approach. On the other hand, you could also be a cream puff negotiator, very accommodating. Anything you ask me, yes, sure. You want me to do that? Okay. Neither of those styles in the extreme is going to be very good. Right? So often we find ourselves more in this compromising. You're not totally accommodating, but you're not totally selfish. You make some deal. But you really could be anywhere in any of these quadrants. And what we're aiming for is how do you balance both? Not just compromise by splitting it down the middle, but how do you reach these win-win value creation opportunities? Firm on the things you really care about, but flexible in how you get there. So if there's 5 different issues on the table, you stay firm on the ones that are really priorities for you. But you can be flexible in other areas, especially if those are the real priorities for the other side. And so that's how we're going to implement this problem-solving approach to negotiation. There's different assessments you can take. Maybe if some of you may have come across these. It's called the TKA, the Thomas Kilmann instrument, but it's like personal assessments where you can see what's your general style. Do you tend to fall in one of these quadrants? But really, in any negotiation we face, we may find ourselves in different areas. So thinking about, am I too accommodating? In which case, maybe I need to be more assertive. Am I too self-focused? In which case, maybe I need to consider the other side's perspective more. Right? How do we really solve this problem by balancing these concerns? Okay, so thinking about yourself, or thinking about others. Are you a distributed negotiator more generally, or are you an integrated negotiation? Well, so if you're making immediate and extreme opening offers, showing no concern for the other side, not asking any questions, avoiding answering questions, not making many concessions, that's definitely a distributed approach to negotiation. Books that talk about that side of negotiation are often like how to use power to meet your goals and how to win. I think The Art of the Deal from President Trump is much more about those sorts of strategies, right? And that's certainly a part of negotiation. And then there's the other books that focus on the win-win and cooperative problem solving. That focus on things like making a reasonable opening offer after initial conversations, showing concern for the other side, sharing interest, asking questions, revealing some information about yourself in order to build trust, in order to have the other side reveal information about themselves, actively listening, asking questions, making trade-offs of priorities and creating new options. So I'd say there's certainly a place for each of these styles in negotiation, but more often than not, I would argue, this integrated approach is going to be better, especially in the long term. Sometimes you really need to be firm, and distributed approach may be helpful, but there's a lot of risks, as you can imagine, with that approach, especially for your relationships. It's a very distributive approach. You're going to lose opportunities to create value. Okay, so this I think relates to your question also about, asking, so why is that important to you is one way, a very direct way, but how else can you get people to open up, maybe share that information? So think about all the different open-ended questions you can ask. What, how, when, where, who, and of course why. Right, as opposed to the other side, just asking closed-ended yes or no questions. You're not going to get much information. Questions that really show concern for the other side. How do you feel about this? What do you think about this? As opposed to loaded or tricky questions that was going to put the other side on the defensive. Here's how I see the situation. Do you agree? Yes or no? Are these the only terms you'll accept? And people tend to, one, not share very much information when you pose questions like that, but they can also get defensive, not open up. And an excellent piece of advice that I think makes complete sense when you think about it, but in practice sometimes we forget about or don't implement, is just be quiet and listen. As opposed to just keep talking and trying to sell. Of a close family friend who does fundraising, I was talking to him once, and he was just fundraising for a nonprofit, and he said, most people think what I do is like try and sell people and tell them all the wonderful things about our organization. He's like, all I do is listen. He's like, I just be quiet, I ask them, what do they care about? What are your interests? And people will start sharing, and then they start giving money, right? There's another good story about getting concessions from just being quiet from a student of mine. As a final project in the course, our students have to go out and do a negotiation. And so this student was buying a diamond ring for his fiancée. He went to a jeweler, and the jeweler brings out the diamond ring, and he's selling him. And my student said he just sat there. And it was probably the most uncomfortable, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and just sat there. And all of a sudden the jeweler's like, you know what, I could cut the price by this, and I'll throw in these things, and just started giving all these concessions because he was quiet, and the guy wanted to make the sale. Right? So being quiet, listening, people will fill that void, and often that can be very helpful. And both in order to gather information on the more integrative side, but sometimes on the more distributive side too, especially if they're very motivated. Okay. Any questions, comments so far? After this, I'll switch a little bit into how to prepare for a negotiation. Yeah.
I have a question. In terms of negotiating with different parties, sometimes I've found that different people have different levels of expertise. So you may find somebody that's very new to negotiating. Sometimes I wonder whether that's good, because initially I would say, well, if he's new to that, maybe he can get a better deal. But on the other side, I don't know whether he's gonna keep his end of the deal because he doesn't know what he's getting himself into. So at the end of the day, I think it's better to talk to somebody that is knowledgeable about what he's doing, even if that means like the negotiations will take longer.
Yeah, I think it can be certainly, did you want to respond to that, or no, you're doing? People who are more experienced negotiators tend, not always, but often will have this more integrative kind of approach where they'll understand that problem solving. Not always, but often if people have enough experience, they see that having this purely self-focused distributive approach can be problematic. So I think in that sense, it might be helpful. And it really depends on what you're negotiating for. If it's with an employee in your company, a new hire, so you're hiring a student right out of school day, and you don't want them to sign some contract that you really kind of give them a bad deal. And then a year later, after working for you, they realize, oh, like, you guys screwed me over, right? So you would want to educate them or help them be educated if it's somebody's relationship. In terms of, there's certainly, I could imagine some advantages if you really want to take advantage of someone who's naive, that, certainly could be a place for that. But I think those would really only be helpful if it's certainly a one-shot interaction where there's not going to be any downstream consequences. But I think often people have the opposite intuition that you did, that, well, if someone's a really experienced negotiator, that would be bad for me. And I'd say that's not necessarily true, because experienced negotiators may really be focused on growing the pie. They may not give you any of that extra value, but there might be some opportunities there. So I don't know if there's a clear-cut, sort of, is it better to negotiate with someone who's more or less experienced? But certainly if it's someone you're going to have a relationship with, to the extent that they feel like, oh, they were inexperienced and then were taken advantage of, to me that suggests it would have some long-term negative consequences. So that's sort of along the lines of what you're asking about?
Yeah, and how well the relationship can keep going on, right?
Mhm.
So if it's very inexperienced, you have this nagging feeling that they may concede or they may not know what they're getting themselves into, so they may not either hold their part of the deal or renege on what, some parts of the contract.
Yeah, and those are definitely areas if there's risk about whether they can actually follow through, are they agreeing to things that they may not be able to do, maybe they're not even aware of it, then those are definitely things you'd want to include in a contract about contingencies, or think about, is that even a relationship worth worth getting into, to try and kind of mitigate some of those risks. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask about under the don'ts, the yes and no.
Yeah.
Is there no place for yes or no's? I feel like getting someone to say yes can like the book How to Influence and Influence People is like,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, that's my concern. That's sort of on a different area. So certainly there's a place for some yes or no questions. Really, if you need to clarify something, getting people to say yes. So this is really, if you want to get people to open up, if you want to try and understand their interest, if you just give them two options, they'll probably give you one of those two options, but they're not going to tell you information like why this is important. Sort of getting back to that. Whereas when you have so if you say, well, is the timing of this important to you? And they could say yes or no, right? You say, well, tell me more about your thoughts on how the timing of this deal, what does that mean to you? What are some of the concerns you have? Or just some of the issues, some of the ways you might frame it as an open-ended question, you can get more information. But certainly, I think, to your point about if you want to influence people, about tactics that are helpful for persuasion, getting people to say yes and generating that sort of positive emotions associated with that, or just some commitment associated with that can be helpful. So there's some great work there's a book called Influence, Science and Practice by Bob Cialdini, the psychologist who talked a lot about how do you persuade people. And that also, similar to what you're saying, gives a lot of information about how if you get people to commit to saying yes to small things, that can lead them to say yes to bigger things. So certainly there's a place for that. This is more about how do you get people to open up and give you more information. Okay, so how do you prepare? To be successful, you need to know how to prepare, you need to know how to organize the information, and this will help you gain confidence. Right? So any negotiation you go into, what should you know? You need to know, what are you going to do if you don't reach a deal today? What's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement? We call this your batten. As you may intuit, your batten is going to be your biggest source of power in negotiation. It's better to have multiple offers than just one. If you are totally dependent on one particular option, not a great negotiating position to be in, but sometimes that's where we find ourselves. So how do you cultivate different options? What you're going to do if you don't reach a deal obviously has implications for what is your walkaway point in this negotiation. That sometimes we'll use the term reservation price or resistance point, your bottom line, these all mean the same thing. Okay? What's the minimum that I would accept? We're talking about money, so that might be the most you'd pay if you're a buyer or the least you'd accept if you're a seller. But even in negotiations that don't involve money, you can think of what's my walkaway? What's the minimum I need to achieve today? So you should know that going into any negotiation. That doesn't mean you would focus on this in the negotiation, because in the negotiation, you want to focus on your target. What's the most I could hope to achieve? What's my aspiration, my ideal outcome? Sometimes inexperienced negotiators will confuse these two. They'll say, I have a budget of this amount, so my target is to get under budget. Or my target is just to do better than my bottom line. Okay? But really these should be separate. When you think about a target, what's the least the other side would accept? Given all the available information, the different reference points, objective standards, what can I reasonably ask? Totally absurd, like that I couldn't justify, but something that's ambitious, but that gives me room to make concessions, that if I got it, I'd be thrilled. And to do your research to figure out what is that target. It should be different than that bottom line. So my background's in psychology, and I'm going to tell you about a study here, which I love because it highlights the difference between psychology and economics. So this is a negotiation role-play simulation. And so you can imagine that half of you are buyers, half of you are sellers, and you're trying to sell this pharmaceutical plant, I think is what they were selling in this particular case. And they gave half of the negotiators a confidential piece of information. That's it. Negotiation experts have found that it's very important in negotiation to know what your bottom line is. Know when you would walk away, and in this negotiation, focus on doing better than that. Okay, so basically, focus on doing better than that reservation price, better than your back. The other half of the negotiators in this study were given a very similar piece of confidential information, but it said, negotiation experts have found that it's very important to identify what's your target, what's the most you can hope to achieve, and focus on achieving that target in the negotiation. Right? So one is do better than your reservation price, the other is focus on achieving that target. And what we have here on the y-axis, this is a standardized score, so 0 being average. Across people in the study, higher scores mean you did better. So you bought for less or you sold for more. And so if you look at the blue bars, as you might expect, people who focused on achieving their target, the best they could hope to achieve, did better. They sold the plant for more, or they bought it for less, right? Compared to people with the reservation price where they did worse financially. But then, again, here's this psychology versus economics distinction. You think more money equals more happiness, right? I sold for more money, I should be happy with it. I should be more satisfied. After the negotiation, when they ask people, how satisfied are you with this agreement? People at the target who did better in the negotiation, less satisfied compared to the people reservation price. And so you think about why that is, because they got more. They did better in the negotiation. But think if you're in this situation, you're aiming for that target. I'm aiming to sell this for $50 million. I got 40. Versus, I just need to sell this for $20 million. I got 30. All right. I achieved that goal. So the idea, you of course want to balance doing better in the negotiation on the financial elements, the strategic elements, but also being satisfied with that. And so during a negotiation, focus on reaching that target. Afterwards, when you figure out, was this a good deal? Well, what was my alternative? What else would I have done? What was my bottom line going in? I did better than that. Right? So during negotiation, focus on your target. After the deal, focus on how much better that is than your reservation price or not. The only time you should really be dissatisfied is if you're reaching a deal that's worse than your best alternative. Right? Otherwise, it's a good deal. Okay, so you need to know your bat amount, your reservation price, target, but of course that's not enough. That's the easy part. What about the other side? What do they care about? What are their interests? What are their priorities? So you have to create a planning document. I'm happy to share a template I have for this. So there's lots of ways to do this. My preferred method is have a column for yourself, a column for the other side. Positions and interests. What are the top things you care about? What's your rank order of those? What are your priorities? Why do you want them? Right, what's your resistance point, target, sources of strength, power, weaknesses, constraints. But then you do the exact same thing for the other side, and obviously you'll have a lot of question marks because you're not going to know that information. But by trying to take their perspective, what do I think their options might be? What do I think their priorities might be? What questions do I want to ask? It's not necessarily going to be a question you ask directly about, what's your bottom line? That's not an effective question. People are not going to share that with you. Maybe the naive negotiators might, but in general, if I just speculate, what might they do? Certainly ask the question about priorities, positions, interests, we can get a lot of information there. So I have to share a story when I talk about planning documents from a friend of mine. I'd been teaching negotiation for a while at that point, teaching about planning documents. I always thought it was a pretty simple tool, makes sense. And then this experience of a friend of mine really opened my eyes about just how powerful sometimes these simple tools can be. So her organization was going through a big restructure. And we were at the bar one night with a bunch of other people, and it was probably like a Wednesday night, and she found out on Monday that there's going to be this restructuring, and she was going to go from a director level to an associate director level, and they wanted her to report to someone in Africa rather than the United States. This was a global organization, and a few other things. And she's really upset, and you can imagine how this goes, a couple drinks, and everyone's like, how dare they treat you like this? This is awful, you should leave, right? And it escalates. And I was getting pretty upset about this. So at some point in the night, I asked her, I said, what do you really care about here? What are your key priorities? Anyway, so I go home that night, I send her a Word document I have with a planning document. And she calls me a few days later and she's like, Taya, that planning document changed everything. I'm like, really? You know, that simple thing? She's like, yeah. She's like, that night and that whole week at work, I felt like my whole life was being negotiated. It was really stressful. It's like I sat down that next morning, filled this out, and I realized I had 3 key things that I cared about. I cared about going from a director to an associate director on my resume, you know, about how that would look. And I cared about a few other things. It's like, and then I did the same for my counterpart, who was our supervisor in the organization. They cared about me reporting to someone in Africa rather than the US because of the big restructuring. They cared about these other things. So, and once I realized that my top 3 issues were completely different than their top 3 issues, so it made, like, my whole strategy made sense. It's like, and so I talked with my boss, he talked to the supervisor, and it's like, I'm gonna retain my director title, I got a raise, I got all these things, and I'll report to the person in Africa, which is really what they cared about with this restructuring. And there's a few other things that were not priorities for her that she was able to make concessions on. And so what she said resonated because it was that mindset of going from, it feels like my whole life is being negotiated, to actually, I care about 3 things, and my counterpart cares about these other 3 things. And because we have differences, we're able to leverage those into an agreement that works well for both of us. And she made some concessions on issues that really weren't priorities for her, but that were priorities for the other side. And so sometimes it's these simple tools about sitting down and really trying to consider both sides that can help us. Because often when we don't prepare effectively, we're just focused on ourselves. Right? We just focus, here's what I want. And we don't take that next step of saying, well, what about the other side? Okay, so we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions, so let me wrap up. When you think about preparing for negotiation, create planning documents, right? They help you identify and organize information. Know what your BATNA is, right? Your best alternative to an agreement. It's a source of power. Most cases you probably would not share that information, or not completely, but sometimes you might want to highlight the strength of it, right? If you have good options. You want to know what your walkaway point is, your reservation price, but that's not information you want to reveal. Know what your target is. Set aggressive goals, which allows you to actually be more cooperative in the negotiation, right? If you aim high, make a first offer that's very high, but it can indicate you have some flexibility, you can make concessions. If you start really low, somewhere right near your budget, right near your bottom line, you have to say no to everything because you have nowhere to go, right? So by being ambitious and aggressive maybe, but justified by the available information you have, you allow yourself to be more flexible. I feel like every airline magazine on negotiation, right? If you don't ask for something, you can't get it, right? So it's certainly true in negotiation. Know what you are asking for, know what you want, right? Research the other party's alternative bottom line. Get more information. That's not necessarily something you want to ask about directly or that they want to share, but if you think about it, you know, you can try and think about, well, what are they trying to gather here? What do they care about? What will they not accept? I take their perspective. Okay. So I wanted to say, sorry, we'll have a few minutes for questions, but I did want to highlight some of these about gathering information. And again, I'll share these. But thinking about questions, and I think this relates a little bit to your question. If you don't want to ask why, well, how do you phrase these questions practically? I really like questions that are about figuring out their priorities. I understand you want both X and Y, but which of these do you prefer? Which is more important to you? Right? What would you need to make it work? Right? Think of all the different kinds of questions. What makes that upsetting? It seems like there's something here that bothers you. Tell me more about that. Right, what would give you more wow? If I increase the value of X or if I increase the value of Y? Right, thinking about how do you pit issues against each other. Because if you ask these yes-no questions, do you care about X? Yes. Do you care about Y? Yes. Right, but how do people value them when you put them together? You know, I understand all these are important to you. You know, we have some areas where we can make some concessions, but we need you to make concessions in other areas. And so putting things in the same context. And then sharing information in order to gather information. Sometimes I'll have students in negotiation exercises will do a big debriefing and they'll say, well, my partner never told me any of that. And so, well, what did you share with them? Well, I didn't share anything with them. They didn't share anything with me. Right? And so we get this vicious cycle. right? So if you reveal information about your interests and priorities, it's going to help them feel comfortable revealing some information to you. This overall increases your profits. Right? Think about anytime you're building a new relationship. First date, first business relationship, whatever. You share a little information about yourself, they share a little bit of information about themselves, but you build this slowly through reciprocity. And again, to the point earlier, this doesn't always have to be done directly. You can communicate indirectly by signaling areas where you have to stay firm, signaling areas where you're more flexible. So issue X is more important to me than issue Y. I care about both. If I were to rank order the issues, X would be higher than Y. I have more flexibility on this issue, I have less flexibility on this other issue. And finally, you can think of different language, right? Instead of negotiating against someone, you're working with them, right? Partners versus opponents. We, ours. Sometimes these subtle linguistic cues can change the tone of the negotiation. I have some comments about this rather than critiques. We're discussing something rather than arguing about it. Okay, so to create value, find out information during the negotiation, ask questions, focus on interest, not positions, and recognize that a purely distributive approach can stymie an agreement, right? Leading to impasse where there doesn't need to be. Okay. I will end here with some recommendations on books. I'm happy to offer more. Getting to Yes is this classic about the problem-solving approach to negotiation. A couple others that I like, Negotiation Genius, Deepak Malhotra, Max Bazerman from Harvard, talks a lot about decision-making biases, how that might affect negotiation, also just a good how-to negotiate book to create value. Another one of my favorites, especially if you're doing anything involving people from different cultures or backgrounds, is called Negotiating Globally by Jean Brett from Northwestern University. Talks a lot about how you think about negotiation, but also how does our different cultural backgrounds and communication styles, how that may vary in negotiation and things to be aware of, especially when we know about differences in trust across cultures and differences in how appropriate direct communication, things like that. Okay, so what questions, comments do you have? Go ahead.
Obviously, it would be great if you went into all negotiations and both sides were taking an integrative approach. But what if you get into a negotiation and you see that clearly the other side is doing a distributive approach?
Right.
And how do you, besides trying to use all the language that you're saying, if you're really not getting anywhere, is there any advice you have as to kind of try to turn it around or getting them to be more open?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it, I think in your question, you intuit the answer in terms of modeling the approach you want. So some of these, kinds of things that you're saying, hopefully the other side reciprocates. That's not always the case. Some people have a very firm mindset that negotiation is this competitive, win-lose kind of situation. And so the more you can model the behavior you want, the more that you can continue to ask questions. Sometimes what you'll find is people want to jump much too soon to offers and counteroffers, and if you can sort of pause and take a step back, because once it's offers and counteroffers and that side of the negotiation, it's very difficult to start sharing information or ask questions. So sometimes it's like, okay, we've been it's before you get there, it's like before we talk about offers, I have some questions that I have, or can you share more about this? So sometimes at the beginning of the negotiation, you can try and set that tone. Other times, if a person really has that's their approach to negotiation, there may not be you can only control yourself. So there may not be a way to force them into a more integrative approach, and then in that case, you have to be mindful that you're not going to enter an agreement where there's a lot of risk, and that if they have that approach, there may not be as many opportunities to grow the pie as there might be with someone who you have more trust with, but at the same time, you wouldn't want to enter an agreement with someone where you feel like you're being taken advantage of, so something to be aware of. So I'd say, doing your best to model, by the language you use, by some of these approaches, and hoping a lot of that will be reciprocated, by not falling into this pattern of offers can help, but you can't always sort of change someone over time, and that can be frustrating, and that's both across the table, but also on your own team. I did an executive training, this was last year or the year before, and there was a guy it was for US Sugar, and he talked about he had to negotiate with this other person from his company, and he wanted to take a more integrative approach with the customers, and his partner was very distributive. And it was very frustrating for him because he would see clients walking away, or they would do a deal, and then as soon as that contract would run out, like they would never work with them again. And he was having a lot of trouble trying to get his partner to understand that, yeah, there may be a short-term win here, a short-term gain by being really kind of screwing over the clients, but they're never going to work with us again. And so he was sort of doing his best to try and share that, but his partner had a very fixed, like, this is what I do to be a good negotiator. And then, if you don't agree with that, in which case he didn't and I wouldn't, because the long-term downsides were far greater than the short-term wins. So it was a challenging one for sure.
I think a couple of us brought up that kind of one of our biggest concerns right now is that like first customer, first client. Can you talk through in that kind of scenario what our BATNA is?
Yeah.
Like what on earth is the alternative to getting you to pay for something?
Yeah, so tell me more about that. So I think, it's a question you'd ask me, what am I going to do if I don't reach a deal? And so what makes that question challenging to answer? Is it, because at some level it's, well, I'm going to wait until the next person comes along, but then you have to figure out what's the timing. What are your thoughts on what's challenging about that?
So I'm just trying to think about kind of coming to that negotiation. Do we really have one? Or is the answer to that in that specific scenario, no, not really? Like,
well, there's always something you're going to do, right? And so, and it depends how you define this word BATNA, because sometimes people say, well, I don't have a BATNA, you don't have another offer. Like, and I would say, well, no, there's always something you're going to do. What's your alternative? So I think of, you're graduating, job offer. Well, I don't have another job offer. Well, there's something you're going to do. Maybe it means moving back home to your parents and sleeping on their couch, and it's not a great option, right? But there is something. So if you don't have that first client, what's going to happen? In the worst case, maybe it's close the company and decide that it's not going to, but maybe then it's like, well, it means we wait another month, or we pivot, right? Or we do something. So I would say even just identifying that will help you identify what is the least you would accept. So even if you don't have another option, my guess is your BATNA would be some form of, we're going to wait some period of time, or we're going to do this as a company, but really knowing what's specific, like if this falls through. Because I think, especially as an early startup, when you want that first client, can be a big risk of signing into an agreement that's not very good, right? You give away too much equity, or you're too stressed or uncertain because you want to get things moving, so you take a very small amount of money and you're giving away a lot. And I think that's a big problem. I know when my husband was first starting his company and getting those early investments, it was a big thing he had to weigh. It's like, okay, there's money now, it's a small amount of money, is this worth accepting? Because we want that money, right? But then it's like, well, how much am I giving away? What's my tolerance for waiting? Mm-hmm. So you can think of your BATNA, it's a long way of answering your question. I'm saying you can think of your BATNA not just as the other offers, because there's always something you're going to do. Often we don't think clearly about what specifically that is. And that can go either way. Sometimes it could be we're overly optimistic, I'll just wait more and more time, but sometimes it can be the other way, we're overly pessimistic, like, oh, I need this right now, and that can lead us into that other trap, that agreement trap. Mm-hmm. And so, thinking clearly about what does this mean if I say no? What does this mean if I say yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so before the negotiation, we prepare our interest position and the other party the best as we can. But during the negotiation, should I be asking questions to find out their interest, their reservation prices, even though they might not reveal that, or?
So I don't think, not necessarily their bottom line. There can be. Sometimes you can ask, what are the other options you're considering? If you ask directly, what's your bottom line? It's not a question. One, they're probably not going to answer it, or they really shouldn't answer it. And if they might be offended, because it's not. So I wouldn't, but the other hand, it's nice if you know that information, but it's not necessarily that important. It can give you a strategic advantage for sure, but really what you're talking with that person, because you're assuming they want to reach a deal with you, or they have some possibility that they think you can offer them something better than what their options are. And you think they could offer you something better than whatever your alternative options are. So I'd say the most important questions to ask are not necessarily about what their BATNA reservation price is, although it may come up a little more indirectly, but more importantly, what are their interests? What are their priorities? Because if you can understand their interests and priorities, you can figure out whether what you're offering meets those interests and priorities. And is there a way that they can get value from doing some kind of work with you? Again, if you know that they don't have, like if they have, in this case, like say they don't have any other options, and you know that their BATNA is very poor, then you can certainly use that strategically. Say, oh, well, I can offer you money right now, and you can certainly, if they don't have any other companies like yours, that may be something you can leverage, but it's not isn't as critical as just understanding why these things are important to them, what are their interests. And asking directly about reservation price BATNA is probably not a good strategy because people are going to be uncomfortable with that. Any other questions, comments? All right, well, my office is upstairs on the 4th floor. I'm around, so